most of your suffering is derived from what your mind is telling you about the situation, but not from the situation itself.
Uh,
And that's an enormous realization. And that can be the beginning of an awakening to see that the narrative in your mind is mostly what causes the suffering. It is possible, of course, that an external situation may cause physical discomfort, obviously.
yes.
That's possible. Your legs are hurting, or back is hurting, or it's too cold or too hot. Physical discomfort, of course, that's possible. But that is not suffering in the sense in which we use this term right here
Uh,
now. The psychological suffering, unhappiness is another word you could use. It's a generic term for any form of negativity inside yourself, unhappiness, suffering. So you begin to realize that most of that arises from a mental narrative about a situation or about your circumstances, but not from the circumstances themselves.
uh,
And then you can begin to practice. Every time you feel upset is arising, some form of anger is arising, some form of negativity, uh, blaming people and situations and saying this shouldn't be happening, or something is
uh,
not happening, but it should be happening, or they should do this, or they shouldn't do it. All
right.
kinds of narratives in your mind. So spiritual awakening is you're beginning to be aware of what your mind is saying. The stories that you're telling yourself about situations, but also the stories you're telling yourself about what you call your life. So, because there are millions of people in this world who live with a very painful sense of identity. They perceive their life as a burden. So they
Yes.
live with this heaviness, and they don't realize this heaviness that they call my life is actually a narrative that they tell themselves. And they say, that's me. All the things that have happened to me, the dreadful things in the past that people did to me or circumstances did to me, or maybe even the bad things that I did. So you get a very heavy identity builds up, and that becomes your sense of self. And people
Uh,
don't realize it's a story you're continuously telling yourself in your mind, but you're so identified with the story that you don't exist. You're outside of the story. And so that is what in some spiritual traditions is called the self. The Buddha called it the self, which is the mind-made sense of self, which the Buddha said, which ultimately he recognized that that mind-made sense of self is ultimately a kind of fiction that you live through. uh, so now, when you realize that this is the case, this means that at this point of realization, another dimension of consciousness has arisen in you, which is not your mind. We could call it awareness, or we could call it presence. So when you realize what your mind is doing, that is not part of the conceptual mind that works through stories and words and concepts. It is a deeper, or you could say deeper or higher
uh,
dimension of consciousness that suddenly has arisen in you. I often call it presence, but another good word for it is awareness. So awareness is the ability to know what your mind is doing. And
uh,
then the wonderful thing is, at first it's just glimpses when you detach from the mind and say, oh, wow. And then you have moments when you're not suffering because you allow this moment to be as it is.
but who are we when we detach from our own mind?
Very good question. Yes. So at first you were identified with the conceptual mind, the story-making mind, and your sense of identity was the story of me.
My past, my memories, my beliefs, my
That's right.
all these thoughts that are accumulated in the bank of my mind from the past that I've told myself, this happened to me, this is what's wrong with me, this is why I'm not good enough, or this person did this, or whatever.
Exactly. Now, when the awareness arises, your sense of who you are, your sense of identity, begins to shift from being lodged in the conceptual mind, the voice in the head. It goes to a deeper place, and you realize who you are in your essence is actually the awareness itself. And that is an amazing realization. In other words, this is a dimension of consciousness that is, I call it, beyond thought. Thinking is a wonderful thing. Thinking is a very powerful tool for creating. However, if thinking is all we have and we look for our identity in the mind, then that is very limiting. If thinking is used as a tool, it's very powerful and empowering and can be very creative. But if thinking becomes self-serving, in other words, you're completely identified with this stream of thinking that never, for most people, never stops. All through the day, they're talking to themselves. There's a voice in the head. Sometimes they say I, sometimes they talk to themselves and you shouldn't have done that. You're not
you
good
idiot.
enough.
Yeah, all these things.
So this is the most important thing in a person's life, and this is why we're here, is to experience this shift in consciousness, so that increasingly, in glimpses at first, but then increasingly, your sense of who you are is the space of awareness, the presence.
Does that mean there's two of us?
One could say that there is, on the one hand, I sometimes call it, on the one hand, you have your form identity. Your form is both the physical body, which is the first thing people identify with, but really it's not the physical body, it's the mental image of my body, which we may be happy about, or either the body can be a source of pride, or it can be a source of shame, or anything in between. And so people identify with my body. That's the first form identification. And the next is the psychological form of me, all the things that I identify with in my past. The past makes up who I think I am, all the past conditioning, starting in childhood, the way by which the culture in which you grow up, the family in which you grow up, all those things become part of your identity. So you have form, I call it form identity on the one hand, and everybody obviously has one. No matter how conscious you are, you continue to have a physical body until you don't. And you have a form identity, a psychological form. But there is a deeper identity also that, and this is spiritual awakening, that is, I call it essence identity, your essence.
Yeah.
And your essence is, if we want to we use the term awareness and we use the term presence. But another term we can use, what that really is consciousness. The essence of who you are is consciousness, the light of consciousness itself. And this is something to be experienced. You cannot understand conceptually what it is that I'm talking about unless you experience in this moment, perhaps, well, it's the only moment there is, unless you experience what that means, that you are, in essence, you are consciousness, the space or the light of consciousness. Between two thoughts, for example, sometimes there's a thought that comes to an end, another thought hasn't arisen yet, you have a gap of 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And it's an experiential thing. To realize yourself as consciousness it implies that at first, for very, very brief instances, the mind becomes still, it subsides. But you are still there. So when you're not, let's say, let's assume that you let go of any memory of your past, because you don't need it right now. You don't remember your past at all, or your name or anything. And you're not thinking about future. In fact, you're not thinking at all, but you are aware. You're aware of your sense perceptions, but you're not interpreting sense perceptions. You're allowing sense perceptions to be. Now, who or what are you when you're not telling yourself who or what you are? Who or what are you without the story? And some people are afraid of that. They're so attached to the story they can't let go. But it's a wonderful practice. For some people, they only let go when the story that they have that they call their life becomes so painful that they can't stand it anymore. And then sometimes they experience a breakthrough.